The inventory listed the house room by room, the drawing room furniture, the library shelves, the silver in the sideboard, the wine laid down in 1809. And at the very bottom of the third page, in a clerk's cramped handwriting, a single line that read, "One dependent, status unclear, presently residing in the East Wing." Nathaniel Dray read the line 3 times. He had purchased Ashwell Park in late October, when the trees had gone bare and the grounds looked like something out of a painting someone had abandoned halfway through. He had not purchased it because he wanted a country estate. He had purchased it because his solicitor told him it was a sound investment, and because the price was low enough that even a man with half his fortune left after his father's debts would not feel the sting. He had not purchased it expecting a dependent. He had not purchased it expecting anything beyond stone walls, leaking roofs, and the particular silence of a house that had been let go too long. He arrived on a gray Tuesday in November. The housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Fitch, who walked with a slight limp and said everything as though she were correcting you, met him at the door and introduced the remaining staff one by one. A cook, 2 maids, a groundskeeper who was older than the Oaks and said nothing at all, and then at the end of the line a young woman in a dark dress who looked at some point just past Nathaniel's right shoulder as though something interesting were happening there. "And this is Jane," Mrs. Fitch said. "Jane," Nathaniel repeated. "She assists with the correspondence and the household records. She has been here some time." "Doing what precisely?" Mrs. Fitch's mouth pressed into a line. "Whatever was needed, sir." Jane still had not looked at him. She was perhaps 25, with the kind of stillness that you noticed after a few seconds. Not the stillness of shyness, but the stillness of someone who had decided very carefully how much of themselves to show. Her dress was plain, her hands were folded. "Everything about her," said servant, clearly and without apology, but her posture did not. Nathaniel said nothing more about it. There were larger problems. A roof in the west wing that had let the rain in all autumn, a drainage issue in the lower garden, and a library in which someone had shelved the books with no discernible logic whatsoever. He had a great deal to attend to. He told himself he would sort out the question of the dependent later. He did not sort it out later. What he did instead was notice her, in the way you notice something you have not yet figured out. She was always present when needed and absent the rest of the time. She knew where everything was kept, the spare keys, the household ledgers, the second set of candlesticks that were actually silver and not plate, the location of the damp patch in the east corridor ceiling that had been there for 6 years and would worsen by spring. She offered this information without being asked, which suggested she had been paying attention to this house for longer than he had owned it. He found this useful. He also found it strange. "How long have you been at Ashwell Park?" he asked her one evening, when he had called her in to help locate the deed records, which the previous solicitor had apparently filed somewhere between a book on Roman architecture and a letter dated 1793. "Several years," she said. She was already moving toward the far shelf, where she pulled out a slim leather folder with the confidence of someone who had put it there herself. "Several years doing what?" "Correspondence, records, whatever was needed." He looked at her directly. "That is the same answer Mrs. Fitch gave me. Then I suppose it is accurate." He took the folder. "What is your full name?" There was a pause, brief, controlled, so small you might have missed it, and then she said, "Jane Calloway?" "And before Ashwell Park?" "I was in service elsewhere," she said. "Will you need the rent ledgers as well?" "They are here." He did not press further. He was a practical man, and she was clearly a capable one, and he had 3 tenant disputes, a contractor quote that had come in twice what he expected, and a letter from his younger brother requiring a careful response. He had enough to manage. He took the rent ledgers. He did not ask again, but he started watching. It was small things at first. The way she could read a legal document, not just read it, but understand it, the way a person does when they have been taught what to look for. She never misread a clause. She never had to be told what a word meant. He had employed 3 secretaries in London, all of them educated men, and none of them had her precision. He mentioned this once, offhandedly, and she said only that she had always been good with papers, and then she went back to what she was doing. He began to wonder who had taught her. In December, his mother came to visit for 2 weeks and stayed for 4. Lady Dray was a formidable woman who had opinions about everything from wallpaper to the appropriate weight of a soup spoon. And she descended on Ashwell Park like a weather event, rearranging the sitting room and declaring war on the curtains in the morning room before she had fully unpacked. Nathaniel endured this with the patience he had developed over 40 years of being her son. On her second day, his mother looked across the breakfast table and said, "Who is that woman?" "Which one?" "The one who brought the letters. She does not move like a housemaid." "She manages the records," Nathaniel said. "Her name is Jane." His mother's eyes narrowed slightly. She had a nose for social distinction that had survived 3 decades and 2 continents. "Jane what?" "Calloway." His mother said, and did not pursue it. But Nathaniel noticed that she watched Jane during the rest of her visit with an expression he could not quite read. He was beginning to understand that expression. In January, a man named Silas Bourne arrived at Ashwell Park. He came in a hired carriage with 2 other men, one of whom turned out to be a solicitor, and the other of whom said nothing useful at any point. Bourne himself was perhaps 50, with the look of a man who had spent a great deal of his life being not quite important and resenting it. He said he was a cousin of the late Lord Casterly, who had been the previous owner of Ashwell Park before he had sold it, and before he had died, shortly after, in the way that men sometimes do when they have already let go of everything they were holding on to. Bourne sat in the front parlor and told Nathaniel that there was a matter of the estate that had not been properly settled. Nathaniel listened with the flat patience he used for people who came to him, expecting to be managed rather than answered. The late Lord Casterly, Bourne said, had a daughter. The room was very quiet. The fire crackled. "Is that so?" said Nathaniel. "A legitimate daughter as it happens. Documented, though she was not acknowledged in the way she ought to have been. The girl's mother died when she was very young, and Casterly was not a man who— well." Bourne cleared his throat. "It was a complicated household. There was a letter, we believe, that Casterly wrote before his death, in which he laid out his intentions regarding the girl. We have been attempting to locate it." "And what are your intentions?" Nathaniel said. "In coming here today?" Bourne's solicitor shifted in his chair. "My cousin's estate was sold improperly," Bourne said, with the confidence of a man who had rehearsed this. "There are certain assets, and a certain matter of recognition, that were not resolved at the time of sale. I am here to discuss what reparations might be appropriate." "Mr. Bourne," Nathaniel said, "you are describing, as far as I can tell, a grievance with the late Lord Casterly, who is dead, regarding assets that were legally sold to me under full contract. I would suggest that your quarrel is with the estate lawyers, not with me." "We believe," Bourne said, "that there is documentation on this property, within this house. We would like to." "You would like nothing on this property," Nathaniel said, still pleasantly. "Without a court order or my specific invitation, I am afraid I will show you out now." Bourne went. He went with the tight-jawed restraint of a man who had not expected that response and would be thinking about it for some time. His solicitor went with him. The man who said nothing useful went last. Nathaniel stood at the window and watched the carriage go. Then he went to find Jane. She was in the library, which was where she usually was when she was not needed elsewhere. She was standing at the far window with a book open in her hands, and she did not turn around when he came in, which meant she had heard him coming and was deciding how to meet him. "A man named Silas Bourne just left," he said. She turned. Her face was very still. "He says he is a cousin of the late Lord Casterly." "Yes," she said, "he is." Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. "He says Lord Casterly had a daughter." The stillness in her face did not change. But something behind her eyes did. Something that had been held very tightly for a very long time. And she looked at him, and then looked down at the book in her hands, and she closed it carefully, the way people close things they have been carrying for too long. "Yes," she said again. "He did." He could have asked her outright then. He chose not to. He chose instead to sit down in the nearest chair, which was an old one that had probably been in this room for 50 years, and to say quietly, "Would you like to tell me who you are?" So she did. Her name was not Jane Calloway. Her name was Marguerite Casterly, and she was the only surviving child of Edmund Lord Casterly, who had been the 4th Baron of Ashwell and a man who had spent the better part of his life making decisions that came apart at the seams. Her mother had died when Marguerite was 7, a fever, winter, the kind of loss that changes the shape of a house permanently. After that there had been nurses, and then governesses, and then a period when Marguerite was simply left at Ashwell Park while her father was in London, and then a longer period when her father was at Ashwell Park too, but was not well, and the house went quiet around him, like water closing over a stone. She had been educated, though not formally. Her father had a library, and he loved it even when he loved nothing else, and he had taught her to read properly, not just the words, but the argument behind them, law, economics, land management. She had learned because there was nothing else to do, and because the books were there, and because, somewhere underneath the long stillness of those years, she had understood that the knowledge might matter someday. She had not understood how it would matter. Her father had sold the estate 2 years before he died. She had not been told until after it was done. He had said it was necessary. The debts, the entailments, the slow collapse of a fortune that had been mismanaged across 3 generations. He had said she would be provided for. He had said there was a letter he was writing that would explain everything, that would make things right, that would ensure she was not left with nothing. He had died before she knew whether he had finished it. After that, there had been a period of weeks that Marguerite did not describe in detail, but that Nathaniel understood, from the shape of her voice around them, had been very bad. There had been lawyers who did not see her as a party to anything. There had been Bourne, who had appeared almost immediately, and who was interested in whatever assets remained, not in her. There had been the house, Ashwell Park, which was no longer hers and which she had no right to, and which she had come back to anyway in December of last year, because she did not know where else to go, and because somewhere in this house her father had written a letter that she believed still existed. She had come back as Jane Calloway. It had been remarkably simple to arrange. "You came back to find the letter," Nathaniel said. "Yes, and have you found it?" She was quiet for a moment. "I know where I think it is. The letter was in the library. Of course it was in the library." Her father had said he would leave it somewhere she would know to look, and she had known all along. Had known when she first came back and stood in this room and ran her hands along the shelves the way she had as a child, but she had not been ready to find it. She had needed to be sure that the man who owned this house was not the kind of man who would use it badly. The letter was inside the cover of a book on Roman land law, tucked into the gap between the binding and the first page, folded twice in her father's handwriting. It was 12 pages long. Nathaniel sat across from her while she read it, and he did not speak, and the fire burned down, and the room got dark except for the lamp on the table between them. When she finished, she held it for a moment with both hands. Then she said very quietly, "He finished it." He had. The letter named her clearly. Marguerite, his daughter, legitimate, born in this house, and he was sorry he had not said it properly while he was alive. He had made arrangements with a different solicitor, not the one Bourne had access to. There was a sum set aside, not large, but not nothing, that was meant for her, and that had apparently been sitting in a bank in London for 2 years waiting for someone to come looking. He had written that he knew the estate was gone, that he could not give it back to her, but that he wanted her to know it had been hers first. He wanted that written down somewhere. He wanted it to be true, even though it was too late for it to change anything. She set the letter on the table between them. Nathaniel looked at it for a while. Bourne wants the house, he said. He has no claim to the house. The house was sold legally. He knows that. She folded her hands in her lap. She had the very controlled quality of someone who had been holding themselves together for a long time and was not quite ready to stop yet. What he wants is leverage. If he can establish that my father's estate was mishandled, he can make a claim on whatever was left, including the sum in London, including anything I might be owed. But with this letter I have documentation. I have a solicitor named in it. I can act. She paused. Assuming you are not going to call Bourne back in and hand him the house keys. Nathaniel looked at her. She looked back at him. For the first time in 6 weeks, she looked at him directly. Not past his shoulder. Not at some neutral middle distance, but at him. And there was something in her expression that was not quite defiance and not quite asking. It was closer to the look of someone who had calculated their odds carefully and was waiting to see whether the numbers held. Why would I do that? He said. Because it would be easier. Because Bourne has lawyers and I have a letter. Because you bought this house in good faith, and now there is a woman in your library telling you it was her father's and she was living here under a false name for 2 months. She paused. Most men would find that inconvenient. Most men, he agreed, might. He reached across the table and picked up the letter. He read it slowly, all 12 pages, while she sat across from him and the fire finished burning down. When he was finished, he set it back on the table. You said he was a man who made decisions that came apart at the seams, Nathaniel said. Yes, this one held. She looked at the letter. Something in her face shifted, very slightly, very briefly, and then she pressed her hands together in her lap and looked at the window instead, where the winter dark was absolute. I will contact Bourne's solicitor tomorrow, Nathaniel said, and I would like to write to the solicitor named in that letter and confirm that the account is accessible. If you will give me the name, you do not have to do any of that. I am aware. He looked at her. I would like to. She was quiet for a moment. Then she gave him the name. His name was Mr. Elias Pryor of Lincoln's Inn, and he was the kind of solicitor who kept meticulous records, and had apparently been waiting for exactly this situation for 2 years, with the patience of a man who had been paid to wait. He came to Ashwell Park in February, when the thaw was beginning and the grounds had that torn-up quality of winter releasing its grip. And he sat in the front parlor, the same chair Bourne had sat in, and confirmed everything in the letter, point by point, with documents of his own. The account existed. The documentation existed. The acknowledgement of Marguerite's birth and legitimacy existed, signed and witnessed, separate from the letter, in a drawer in Pryor's office that no one had thought to look in because no one had known to ask. Bourne came once more, in March. He brought the same solicitor and the same silent man, and he sat in the same chair, and he looked at Nathaniel with the expression of someone who had expected a different outcome. Nathaniel said, I believe you have met Miss Casterly. Marguerite was standing near the window. She had stopped wearing the plain dark dress. She had stopped standing as though apologizing for her own existence. She stood the way she must have stood before all of this, or perhaps the way she was deciding to stand now, which might have been the same thing, or might have been something new. Bourne looked at her. He looked at Pryor's documents. He looked at the letter. He looked at Nathaniel. He said, "This is not over." Nathaniel said very pleasantly, "Mr. Bourne, I have reviewed every legal document associated with the sale of this estate, and I have had 2 of my own solicitors review them as well. You have no claim here that would survive a court. I would advise you, strongly, to consider the cost of pressing one." Bourne left. He did not come back. It would be tidy to say that everything resolved itself cleanly after that. That the paperwork was done, the account secured, the lawyers satisfied, and that Marguerite packed her things and went on to build a life somewhere that was not her father's house. That is not quite what happened. What happened was slower and stranger and less tidy than that. She stayed through March. She was there because there were still documents to handle, still correspondence to manage with Pryor, still a process of formal recognition that required her presence and her signature and, several times, her patience with people who were not entirely sure how to address a woman who was simultaneously the daughter of a former baron and a person who had been living as household staff for 2 months. She stayed because the work was not finished. She also stayed because Nathaniel asked her to stay. He did not ask her the way people ask for things they expect to receive. He asked her in the way he had asked her about the letter. Quietly, without performance, as though he were stating something he had already established to his own satisfaction, and was now presenting to her as information, he said, in the library, on an evening in late March, when the grounds were beginning to look like something worth looking at again. "I do not need a household manager. The house has one. But I find myself, frequently, wanting to discuss things I would rather discuss with you than with anyone else, and I think that means something. I think you know it does too." She stood with her hands resting on the back of a chair, not folded, not held together, just resting, and she looked at him with the directness she had given him since the evening of the letter, and she said, "You might be wrong about what it means." "I might be," he agreed. "I would be willing to determine that more carefully if you were." Outside, the last of the frost was coming up from the ground in the way that late winter does, retreating so slowly you almost miss it. The oaks at the end of the drive were beginning to think about leaves. The house, which had been cold and bare when Nathaniel arrived in November, had the feeling now of something that had been waiting to be inhabited properly, not just lived in, but cared for. It had been cared for. It had been cared for years, through a closed-off season and a long holding still, by a woman who had loved it before she had any reason to think she would be allowed to. Marguerite looked at the window. She looked at the room. She looked at Nathaniel, who was watching her with the careful attention of a man who had learned, sometime in the last 4 months, that the most important things in a house were not listed in any inventory. "All right," she said. More carefully then. It was not a grand statement. It was not, in itself, very much. But she meant it the way she meant everything, precisely, and without waste, and with the full weight of what she was, and what she had survived, and what she was, now, choosing. The oaks came into leaf. The roof was repaired. The library was reorganized, finally, into a system that made sense, and that both of them had agreed upon, after 3 evenings of productive disagreement. The account in London was settled in Marguerite's name. A portrait was commissioned for the hall. Not a formal one, nothing stiff, just 2 people in the library they both lived in now, with the late afternoon light coming through the tall windows the way it always did. The house stood at the end of the long drive, as it had always stood, patient as stone, and for the first time in a very long time, every room in it was occupied.